Okay, good morning to each of you. Nutrition class is about to begin. Um, yeah, welcome as we continue this weird semester. I want to, here we go. What I'm going to do first of all is pull up a couple things that I want to look at with you, and then we'll talk through some things. Be thinking. I will want to just have a little bit of a discussion. The assignment 8, the assignment where you were looking at reviews on low carb versus low fat. Obviously, each of you is only choosing one article. There are several. Some are looking at diabetes, some are looking at weight loss, some came to one conclusion, some came to the other. So I'll be asking you for just a brief talk, like half a minute or something, just so that we can share what you found in these various articles as far as whether they were, for whatever outcome they have, whether they were finding that low carb was a better option or low fat, or they couldn't really distinguish, or maybe one was better in the short term and one was better in the long term, just to mention a few highlights from your article. So be thinking about that. In the meantime, we're obviously in a challenging time, and I've been seeing some headlines. So I just was looking at food banks, and not surprisingly, we're seeing a big rush on food banks given all the people that are losing jobs. Schools are struggling to supply meals. Many kids depend on school meals during the school year and even during the summer, and now suddenly schools are closed, and so schools are trying to continue meal distribution even though the schools are closed. So I just wanted to give you a few of the things that I'm seeing out there. This is just a search for food banks and seeing what happens. So this one got some attention down in Florida. Stark photos show miles long of cars waiting outside a Florida food bank. Demand surges by 600%. 500,000 residents in Florida are filing for unemployment. So literally, really long areas, pretty dramatic. This is apparently people lined up for a food bank. But interestingly so this is in Florida. They have a glut of fresh produce to give away because coronavirus outbreaks have forced governments to shut down hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, cruise ships, airlines, that type of thing. And so farmers who rely on this business have an excess of perishable crops, and they're giving it to the food banks. So initially, at least, maybe the food banks are benefiting from lots of fresh produce. So it's an article mostly of pictures, but pretty dramatic. Pretty dramatic there. It looks like they've got green beans. Yes, in Florida this time of year, they're picking green beans. Washington State is getting some coverage. There is concern that the food banks might run out of food. So this is a news article called "Washington Officials Who Run Food Banks Say Major Food Insecurity Crisis May Only Be a Few Weeks Away." There's been tremendous increase in demand. Also, maybe people are less willing to give. Food drives, collecting cans, that type of thing. And then also people who just give money, because in fact, well, Boy Scouts collecting food for food banks, or you donating cans here or there, that is beneficial. It raises the profile. It keeps the food bank in the public eye. Food banks actually prefer cash donations. Then they can buy what they want, buy what they need. And with many people more concerned about their finances, maybe they're not getting as many donations. Put it simply, Washington can expect to see an empty food bank shelves in 2 weeks unless there's a sudden change in the food distribution system. And by their very nature, distribution systems are challenging to change. So keep your eyes and ears open. Feeding America says that they're seeing a 40% increase in clients, a significant decrease in deliveries because of an uptick in grocery store usage and a drop of volunteers. So it's sort of this perfect storm. Grocery stores also are a source of food for food banks, and since restaurants are closed and people are eating out less, they're cooking more at home, so grocery stores are actually selling more of their food, so it's less likely that they'll have excess baked goods, greens, that tins of spinach or cartons of spinach that may have expired. So there's actually, food banks are going to be squeezed. The school district in Yakima ran out of school meals on March 27, and they changed from daily to weekly distributions. She has to scramble to feed her families, just focusing on a person there. So I thought I'd mention that just because we'd spent time earlier in the semester talking about food banks, food distribution systems, and the fact that economic conditions, you'll remember a question on the midterm test, how do economic conditions affect food insecurity and hunger? We're definitely going to see an impact with that. Okay. Next thing I want to look at is the course syllabus. I made just a few small changes. I'll pull it up here. So we are on week 13. Week 13, and this week we're changing topics yet again. Yeah, here we go. So we're going to be looking at issues relating to food safety. And we're also then, depending on the time, we're going to transition to looking at GMO foods and then organic food and organic food production. So the next week and a half, even closer to 2 weeks, I'm honestly not sure if we're going to get to this international nutrition issues. We'll see. But for this week at least, food safety, GMO foods, that's our topic for the next little bit. So that has been updated on the Moodle. So I'm okay. And the next thing, here we go. Okay, next thing, just to mention a few more upcoming deadlines, reminders of where we are in the class. So I mentioned small updates to the syllabus. Assignment 8, that is the review of the article report on the systematic review, is officially due today. Try to get it in soon, within the next day or two. This is a reminder for a week from now, because you'll remember next week we have a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday schedule, and this class does not meet on Tuesday. And then a week Thursday, so 9 days from now, a reminder that we're having our next of the class debates. Organic foods are not safer, healthier, or more environmentally friendly than conventional grown foods, and are thus a waste of money. So I stated it in the negative. So Lauren and Courtney are going to be agreeing with this statement that they're not safer and they're a waste of money, and Katerina and Sarah are going to be saying, no, they don't agree with this statement, taking the opposite perspective there. Okay, so that's sort of where we are right now. Can you go ahead and turn on your screens? I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion, feedback, and chat on the low-fat, low-carb review articles that you've been looking at. So if you haven't, let's see your smiling faces. And who'd have thought that the semester would end this way? Let's see, we've got 4, 8, 12, 13. So a few of us aren't here for whatever reason. I am recording the class. I didn't upload the recording the past couple times because pretty much everyone had signed in, but at least one of you had checked in telling me you weren't going to be here, someone who's not talking with us. So, okay. So what did you read? What did you find out on this low carb, low fat? I'd basically just be interested in hearing like 30 seconds or at most a minute of what your particular article was, some of you may have chosen the same article, and that's fine, but just so we sort of pollinate, share the ideas, that the conclusions that were expressed from these various articles. Who wants to tell us what they read? Sarah.
So I read the articles I was looking at. Let me see if I get it pulled up. Where'd it go? It was titled Low Carbohydrate and Low Fat Diets, What We Don't Know and Why We Should Know It.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically what they did is they just evaluated, they looked at both a ketogenic and a low carbohydrate diet, and just to see, it was a literature review, so it wasn't a meta-analysis, but they just wanted to see if there was any benefits to taking a low carb diet, and didn't really see that much of a difference between the two. And they didn't really find a lot of evidence for any long-term benefits necessarily. They said that it's pretty variable, and for some people the diet works and some people it doesn't. So that's kind of what they concluded, is that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all with it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, when I talked about this earlier, even this idea of long-term and sustainability of the diet, it's really clear that at least for some people, a low-carb diet can cause short-term and rapid weight loss. That's pretty clear. But over the longer term, the studies haven't necessarily been done. So both in terms of what's the longer impact on the body for people who are in ketogenesis, a ketogenic diet for a long time, and then secondly, is that even sustainable? Can people who commit to do it, are they able to? Because you have to remember, there's diet, and then there's sort of, well, the rest of my life. So most of you are late teens, early 20s. So what's your diet going to be for the next 50, 60, 65 years? You know, and is it sustainable? And so even if there was an ideal diet, let's say that a ketogenic diet turned out to actually work really well for the long term, if the vast majority of people weren't able to sustain that or maintain that, would it then be good as a public health recommendation? And that's questionable. And that's the whole issue. And when I was in my grad school program, the idea of translational research, taking something that maybe works well in a clinical trial in controlled settings. So maybe we had a clinical trial of a ketogenic diet, and you had support, and maybe the people were being paid, and there was counselors and all that. But does it work in a community setting? So that's the project I was working on, was a diabetes prevention program in a community setting. Does it work, you know, for longer term with less support? And that's going to be an issue. Let's see, Courtney, what article did you look at?
I looked at the Mayo Clinic's clinical review of our low carbohydrate diets, safe and effective. And the conclusion that they came to was that low carbohydrate diets seem to have short-term effects with weight loss without negatively affecting blood pressure, glucose, and cholesterol. But they couldn't make any conclusions about long-term results.
Okay, so similar types of issues. Madeline, what was yours?
I looked at the one that is a low carb, high fat diet recommendable.
Mm-hmm.
And like they found the similar results where like they can see the short-term effects of it, and it has like positive with weight loss, and like with people who have pre-diabetes or diabetes, it like helps them control their insulin levels, but they don't have any long-term effects, so they can't really recommend it to people.
Okay, Shamrock, which one did you look at?
I looked at the effect of reducing total fat intake on body weight. And from this, it found that, so it was a meta-analysis, and they looked at 33 different trials, and they found that on average, you could reduce body weight by a little bit from going on a reduced fat diet.
Okay, so was there any comparison, or it was basically just looking at the
It was just a low-fat diet. It compared to like a regular diet, like the average American intake of fats.
Okay.
And it said, on average, I think it was over a 6-month period, the lower fat reduced body weight by 1.6 kilograms.
Okay. So that's illustrates a couple important points that I mentioned earlier. The idea, what are you comparing? That was one of my points when looking at these. So this is low fat versus a more standard diet. And the same issue applies. I'm not picking on a low carb diet. Is a low fat diet sustainable? Maybe a person can, do a super low fat diet for a short period of time. Studies, or Shamrock reported, maybe 6 months, but are people willing or able to do the low fat for month after month, year after year? Yes, there are a few people, but is that going to be generally relevant and generally attainable dietary recommendations for most people? And that's a legitimate question. Amber, how about you? We're not hearing you.
I had the same one that was mentioned earlier. The overweight diabetes prevention is low carb, high fat diet recommendable. And basically, it was talking about 3 questions like long-term effects of low carb and high fat intake, and the effects that result of weight loss, and let's see. Basically what was said earlier.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We don't need to hear from multiple people. If the one you looked at's already been done, that's fine. How about Josie? Which one did you do?
I did the same one as Sarah, so the low carbohydrate and low fat. And
Okay.
basically came to the conclusion that short term you could see weight loss depending on the person and how strictly they followed it, but in regards to long term, they weren't sure how like positive effects they had.
Okay. Katie, which article did you do?
I did the same one as Courtney, involving the Mayo Clinic and looking at low carb diets.
Okay. Let's see. Serena, did you do anything that we haven't heard from?
I did the Mayo Clinic one as well.
Okay. Lexi?
I did the effects of popular diets without specific calorie targets on weight loss outcomes.
Okay, we haven't heard about that. Tell us that one.
It just looked at, I think, 7 different diets, like popular diets that fit their criteria, and then they tested it out over a year to see like which was the best for short-term weight loss and long-term weight loss. And the results actually were that the Atkins diet was like the most, gave the best results for both short-term and long-term, but it said that there wasn't like enough information really to like make a good like evaluation of it. But
And so this paper, they were looking at all sorts of these popular diets, right? Like South Beach and Atkins and ones that you might have heard of.
Yeah, the ones that they looked at, one second, were the Atkins diet, the DASH diet, glycemic index, Mediterranean, Ornish, Paleolithic, and Zone.
Okay, so we've heard some of those. The DASH diet is like a reduced. Oh, actually, that came up in
stop hypertension.
Yeah, that one came up. Those of you in epidemiology class, one of the papers looking at high blood pressure mentioned the DASH diet. So that's one that's well known. Let's see. Some of you I'm not seeing pictures of. Maybe you don't have a camera. Maybe it's not working. Alyssa, which one did you work on? Anything new that we haven't talked about?
I worked on our low carb diet, safe and effective.
Okay, and that's one we heard about already, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Jessica?
I did the Mayo Clinic one too.
Okay, and Michael?
I also did the Mayo Clinic.
Okay, popular one apparently. Devin?
I did the one about low carbohydrate versus a low-fat diet with metabolic control in people with type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so that one we haven't heard from yet. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay, tell us about it.
So they just compared a low-carb diet with a low-fat diet on people with type 2 diabetes, and basically they found that there's a low to moderate certainty that a dietary carbohydrate restriction with a maximum of 40% yields slightly better metabolic control. But overall, there's really not enough evidence to support anything.
Okay. Curious there. Notice, interestingly, said Devin mentioned maximum of 40% carbs. By some people's categorizing, at least, that wouldn't be considered, terribly low. That's certainly not a ketogenic diet.
No.
So that again raises the issue of what is a low carb diet? What is a low fat diet? And sometimes we throw these terms around, but the definitions and how they're used might be quite different. And so you said the overall conclusion was, maybe run that by us once more, Devin.
It's just that like a low carb diet, not a full reduction in carbs, is slightly better, but overall there's really no evidence to support any concrete theories.
And again, I'd also remind us, at least of my strong belief, not all carbs are equal. So is a low carb diet mean that you don't eat potatoes and carrots and starchy vegetables? Or does it mean that you don't eat the sodas and the donuts? And so there's all sorts of it's a pretty broad category, and so to make conclusions can be a challenge. Okay, Ethan, which one did you look at?
I looked at the low carb, low fat meta-analysis, metabolic risk one.
Okay.
So that one, there were specific requirements for what the studies that they looked at. Specifically, they were looking at long-term because the study had to have been for 6 months or more. They had to have reported what sort of metabolic risk factors that they increased or decreased in. And then they found in the end, by the end of this meta-analysis, that both were equally effective with reducing body weight and waist circumference. But one thing that they did find out in particular was low fat is usually recommended because of the fact that it helps reduce metabolic risk factors. However, they did find in low carb diets that they could also be just as effective in reducing metabolic risk factors.
Okay, so we've heard from most. Oh, Lauren, I didn't call on you yet, did I?
No, I did the same one as Courtney though.
Okay. So have we heard from everyone? I think we have. So I hope this helps your understanding of this issue. And I also did want to point out, so let's see, who did we, Devin was talking about looking at low carb and low fat for people with diabetes. Ethan was looking at an article that specifically talked about metabolic risk factors. And so we're talking about high blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, blood glucose, these type of conditions. And pretty much all of you from the various papers you look at either said there's not enough information, or there's not a significant difference between the two, right? None of them came out clearly and said, yeah, low carb is the way to go, or low fat is the way to go. It's complicated, and there is no clear-cut, obvious advantage to one over the other, at least in a broad application of situations. And so I think the reason I had you do this is so you hear someone on TV, you read a book, and low carb paleo is the way to go, or low fat raw vegan is the way to go. And it's not clear, the evidence isn't supporting either of those, at least in the long term, for the majority of the population. So that I hope this informs your decisions, makes you a little bit more cynical, a little bit more credulous, as far as when you read things, or even when you hear people talking, you know, oh, my friend goes on a paleo diet or went into ketosis for 6 months and lost 50 pounds. I'd say great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, or that your friend needs to do that for the rest of their life, that type of thing. So let the evidence help you make your decisions. And as I talked about in the last class period, let perhaps other factors influence, cost, ethics, environment. Some of these types of factors can also weigh in to our dietary decisions, because the science, at least on that issue, low carb versus low fat, isn't unambiguous. Okay, so if you haven't finished up that review assignment, do it in the next day or two, get it in, and so you can move on to other things. Actually, I should ask, just out of curiosity, are any of you still on campus here in Helena? I see, okay, it's about 3 or 4 of you, yeah, and many of you have gone home or elsewhere. And let's see, is Devin in Las Vegas, or what's your background today?
Yep, I'm in Las Vegas today.
Okay, so oh, I didn't realize. So is that your hometown?
No.
Okay, so are the casinos open? Are you cleaning up? No.
No, the casinos are closed, so they just let me run around.
I visited Las Vegas once in my life, and I actually left about, I think it was $80 or $90 richer than I arrived. So I had made myself, I said, okay, I'm going to spend $20 on the slot machines. And I'm down to, you know, spent most of it, and then it kicked out like $120 or something like that. So I actually made a little bit when I visited Las Vegas, including my hotel. So, but anyhow. Okay, so that's then wraps up our consideration of this low fat and low carb. I'm going to now transition, and we're going to talk a little bit and look at some things related to food safety, some of those types of issues. So you're welcome to keep your screen on, but I won't be looking at your smiley faces conversationally in the same way. So if you want to turn them off or leave them on, it's up to you. But okay. Okay, so what we're looking at today, beginning this issue, is food safety in America. And in about 120 years or so ago, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a class of journalists that were called muckrakers. We'd call them sort of investigative journalists now. One of them, the most famous one, some of you may have heard of, a guy named Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. Again, some of you might have heard about that. And this is sort of where modern American food safety legislation and awareness evolved, or first showed up. I'm going to go to that page here and tell you a little bit more about Upton Sinclair and his, oh, here goes. Okay, so this is just some background information. Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, muckraking the meatpacking industry. And he wrote The Jungle to expose the appalling working conditions in the meat industry. Diseased, rotten, contaminated meat. But notice what he said, his initial goal was in fact to deal with the working conditions. It wasn't so much a public health, a food safety expose. It was more, hey, these people are working under horrific conditions. A little bit more background. Known as progressive reformers, were reacting to problems caused by growth of factories and cities. Okay, the progressives started to attack big companies like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, meat packing companies, These companies, these progressives revealed how these companies eliminated competition, high prices, and treated workers as wage slaves. And in Chicago, talks a little bit about President Roosevelt. Few places had more filth on the floor than meat packing houses in Chicago. Chicago was the center of the US meat packing stock industry, and 4 major meat companies had bought out small slaughterhouses. They were so large they could dictate cattle prices to the cattle ranchers, the growers, the consumers. And there was concern about working conditions. And I'm going to show you a little brief clip that deals with that issue.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves back-breaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that permeated also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
When The Jungle was published, there was a public outcry. Americans were outraged, and they urged the United States Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. More federal laws followed that prevented packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. And United States Department of Agriculture inspectors were put in every meat plant in the country. But this wasn't the reaction that Sinclair was looking for. He wanted to help the workers. "I aimed at the public's heart," he wrote, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." It took decades to improve the working conditions Sinclair criticized in The Jungle. The changes came from inside the factories themselves, from members of labor unions making demands of the factory owners. The Jungle's pro-worker viewpoint may have been lost on the public at the time, but its powerful message is clear today.
It was a microcosm, a look at the 20th century as it was unfolding and all the different battle lines between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in that sense, it's an enduring classic.
Okay, so that gives you just a little bit of a view of The Jungle, Upton Sinclair. He's trying to expose the working conditions, and I like his statement, "I aimed for their heart, the public's heart, and I hit them in the stomach." And the public reaction and the government reaction was, "Oh, we've got to have better food safety. We've got to have USDA inspectors because we want our meat, our food to be safe." And are conditions better in packing houses now than they were back then? Yeah, somewhat, but it's still an issue. Most of the people in many parts of the country who are working in the slaughterhouses, killing animals, cutting them up, in many parts of the country, those are mostly immigrant workers. I know for a fact up in Canada, in Alberta, there's a town where there's a large slaughterhouse, and it's largely operated, largely staffed. The workers are mostly from Africa, African immigrants. These aren't the type of jobs that established Americans did. And so back 120 years ago, it was immigrants from Europe. And now it's immigrants from Central America, from Africa, from Mexico, who are again doing the work, which is, I'll say, less dangerous. There are more worker protections, but it's still dangerous and low-paying jobs, so that we can have cheap food. And as I would acknowledge, it's not just a meat versus vegetarian issue. The workers in the fields, picking the fruit, spraying the crops with herbicides and insecticides, whatever, it's the same issue. It's the same issue. We have cheap food, whether it's fruits and vegetables or meat, and at least part of the reason for that cheapness is because of the working conditions of the people who are growing it, processing it, killing it for us. So it's a larger issue. And it's not even food. Why can I go to Walmart? Well, I don't shop at Walmart, but if I did, why can I go to Walmart and buy socks or t-shirts for as cheap as I can? Well, because somewhere in Dominican Republic or Bangladesh, someone is working at a sewing machine for 50 cents an hour or whatever it is. I'm just pulling out a small number. And we can have cheap food, and we can have cheap clothes, cheap electronics, that type of thing. Okay, so those are some larger issues to think about as you make purchasing decisions. Okay, so then let me share the next one here, getting back to our handout. And asking the question, well, how safe is our food? In epidemiology class, we looked at a documentary talking about chicken, but how safe is our food? And so this next article, and it is a few years old, but it's covering a significant time period. They are looking at food safety in this country. Let's take a look at that. I'll pull it up here in a minute. Okay, so this is an estimate, a calculation of food safe, of people who are sick related to food in this country. So I'll just mention a few things about it, and then we'll look at the data themselves. Each year, more than 9 million foodborne illnesses are estimated to be caused by major pathogens acquired in the US. 9 million people, okay? What they did is take state and local health departments' reports of food disease outbreak to the CDC. Foodborne illnesses are reportable to the CDC. Reports include, when available, the number of people, the outbreak etiology, basically the history, the pathway of the outbreak, which foods were used, a list of ingredients, and so forth. And what they did, their goal is to attempt to attribute food commodities for an estimated 9.6 million illnesses, 57,000 hospitalizations, and 1,400 deaths caused by known agents. Okay, how do they calculate food? How do they categorize food? So when they're attributing causes of death, causes of illness, they're looking at aquatic animals, and they subdivide that into fish and shellfish, and then further into crustaceans and mollusks. Land animals, animal food, dairy, eggs, then a meat and poultry category, which again is subdivided into poultry, primarily chicken, and then beef, game, pork. Then we've got the plant foods. subdivided into grains and beans, oils and sugars, produce, which is divided into fruits and nuts, and then vegetables, fungi, leafy vegetables, root vegetables, sprout vegetables, and vine stalk vegetables. Okay, so we get to the essence here, where they are outlining, where they are specifying, where are these foodborne illnesses coming from? And so you can see by category, we've got the numbers, you know, remember that however many million it was, just to remind us, 9.6 million illnesses. So here they're dividing that up. Of that, 589,000 were from aquatic animals, that's 6.1%. And then you can see how it's divided here into fish, shellfish, and so 2.7 plus 3.4 is 6.1% there. So you can see 6.1% of these illnesses came from aquatic animals, 41% came from land animals, 51% came from plants. So it's pretty close in terms of animal-based foods versus plant foods in terms of the percents that are attributable. Okay, and then they further subdivide it down. Let's look at land animals. Of the land animals, which is 41% of the total, 64% were bacterial illnesses, 13% were chemical related, 0.1% were parasitic, and about 30% were viral. So 64 and 13 and 30 and 0.1, that's going to give you 100% then, specifying where it comes from animals, and then they divide it down further. So for example, poultry, 41% is bacterial, and so forth there. So you can see it. And then the same thing with plants. So as you look at plants, and someone maybe can chime in. Well, I'll just draw your attention. So plants, 51% of the total is plants. Of that 51%, almost half of it is produce. And of the produce, you can see that the biggest single category of the vegetables, of the produce, it's mostly the vegetables. And of the vegetables, the biggest single category is leafy vegetables. And you can see that then about 5.1% is bacterial, chemical, and then 35% is viral. Okay, so your leafy greens are, of the plants, they are an important source related to foodborne illnesses. You don't need to turn your screen on necessarily. What is it about leafy greens you think that makes them a large category of sources for foodborne illness? I'll pick on someone. You don't need to show your face. Lauren, what is it about leafy greens, you think?
I probably think that it's more probably like the pesticides and stuff that are used like during making, growing them.
Mm-hmm. So pesticides, that would be under the chemical category. In terms of percent, it's not terribly high. The bacterial and certainly the viral are higher, so undoubtedly chemical is part of it. But how about say the viral or the bacterial? Devin, any insights about why we'd have such leafy greens being associated with viral illnesses there?
It's so like you can wash them, but there's still going to be like moisture inside during storage, and so that causes like bacteria to grow in it.
Bacteria or virus contamination, yeah.
Yeah, so that would be like the biggest thing.
Okay. Think of it even from like a physical perspective. Leafy greens, you got a head of lettuce. You've got all this surface area. It's hard to wash. It's hard to wash all that surface area. If you have a tomato, you have an apple, it's got sort of a smooth surface. You can put some soap even, and you can be pretty sure that you can wash most of whatever is on the surface off, whether it's chemical, whether it's virus potentially or bacteria. You can't do that with lettuce. How about baby spinach? You've got all these little leaves. Okay, so it's just a simple physical reality, just all that surface area for bacteria, viruses, chemicals to be there, and it's hard to wash it off. Okay, so that's an important one, just the physical reality. Also, think, we haven't talked about this yet, what about how it is prepared, particularly in terms of bacteria or viruses? Alyssa, any insights about why leafy greens might be more susceptible when you think about how they're prepared? So this is separate from the washing, how they're prepared and eating. Maybe not. Ethan, any insights on the actual preparation of leafy greens, which might make them susceptible?
I mean, there could be some pesticides in having it travel across. I mean, like how you mentioned earlier in classes, how bananas are easily able to be transported, and that's why they're cheap in fruit produce. So maybe some other processing chemicals that can help may leave them more vulnerable as a result.
Perhaps.
Possibly.
Yeah, that's also, I'm thinking specifically about raw versus cooked. So when you're talking about bacterial contamination, viral contamination, if we cook things, that's going to kill much or most of the, at least pathogens in terms of living organisms. But we eat a lot of our greens, our leafy greens, salad, spinach, raw. So you don't have that benefit of heat then. That's the main reason why leafy greens are higher there. And obviously, cooking is going to be an issue as well for your meat and your poultry. You can see 41% bacterial. Well-cooked meat, thoroughly cooked meat, should kill all the bacteria and the viruses. So you can say that uncooked or foodborne illnesses linked to meat are almost always going to be, at least the bacterial viral ones, are going to be related to cooking and the length of time. So here, the last thing I want to look at on this particular paper, looking at number of illnesses, and you can see there's leafy greens up at the top there. These are estimates where you've got a most probable estimate and then a confidence interval. You can see the confidence intervals are pretty wide, but leafy vegetables being the #1 source for illnesses, dairy being the #1 estimate in terms of hospitalizations, and poultry is #1 in terms of deaths. So a lot of that's going to be salmonella related. The numbers aren't vast. This is over a 10-year period, but the estimate is that about 300 people over a 10-year period, or you could say about 30 people a year in America die from illnesses related to eating chicken. Is that a lot? Not in a country of 300 million, but it just illustrates that this does happen. It's a reality. Oh, one more thing. I've emphasized, we've drawn attention to leafy vegetables. And we think, well, leafy vegetables, leafy greens are healthy. Where are diseases that affect humans, like bacterial diseases, viral diseases that affect humans? How are they getting on leafy greens? Any insights or perspectives? Are these plant diseases that make humans sick? So you've got some disease of the lettuce and you eat it and it's infecting the lettuce, a viral infection of the lettuce? Is that what we're talking about? No, no. In most cases, in almost all cases, it's not a lettuce disease, a cabbage disease. Most plant diseases aren't going to make humans sick. It's contamination. Maybe a disease from the people who are harvesting the lettuce or the cabbage. Or even more commonly, if they're using manure, animal manure, or in some parts of the world, even human manure, for fertilizing the greens. Manure has all this nitrogen in it. Leafy greens love nitrogen, so if you're putting animal manure on plant crops, that's how the contamination, the bacterial or viral contamination. It's not a lettuce disease per se. The lettuce, the cabbage, the spinach is being contaminated by diseases that do affect humans, but don't blame the lettuce, don't blame the cabbage. They're not to blame. It's how humans are raising it then that is causing the illness. Okay, so that gives you some data, some facts, and there's more tables and more details, but that gives you a good perspective then on foodborne illnesses in this country in terms of the data. Let me just go back here. So then, why is it that foodborne illnesses are so common? And I'll say that's a relative statement, but the fact is people get sick. If it's 9 million over 10 years, 900,000 reported foodborne illnesses, and it's obviously going to be much more because not all of them are reported. Sometimes I eat something, sometimes you eat something, and oh, you got a bit of an upset stomach. It might be just a mild form of foodborne illness. So food is moist, it has nutrients, and it's neutral to slightly acidic pH, most foods. It's a great medium for microorganisms to grow, bacteria particularly if we're talking about growing. The trend of raw or undercooked foods, whether it's vegetables or meats. Used to be that people cook their food, cook their peas, cook their carrots, cook their meat, all the life out of it. We'd call it now overcooked. But for health reasons, because less cooking does maintain more vitamins, the incentive for food industry to increase shelf life. If something is on the shelf for longer, there's more time for microorganisms to grow, become contaminated that way. And another one is the idea that food is prepared in central kitchens, regional kitchens around the country and distributed widely. So if you buy a tub of potato salad at Safeway, that wasn't made in Helena. That might have been made in Spokane, or it might have been made in California or in Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. So you've got a smaller number of large commercial kitchens that distribute in many areas across the country. That's both good and bad, because there are fewer places to monitor and inspect and keep clean. But if there is a contamination, an outbreak in a certain area, a certain kitchen, a certain processing facility, it can be spread very widely. We saw that, those of you who have been in epidemiology class, in the Foster Farms chicken. Okay, there's an outbreak in a chicken in a processing plant in Washington State, and it's all up and down the West Coast and into Arizona and New Mexico. And as the food is distributed more widely, the possibility for larger outbreaks increases. Okay, another one. And the use, and I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but it's something to consider, to be aware of. The use of antibiotics in food animals encourages microbial resistance. Some of you may know this. 70% of antibiotics used in the US are used on livestock, not human. Livestock, chickens, pigs, the whole bit. Take a look at this. the Natural Resources Defense Council is, in their words, trying to save antibiotics. Okay, they've got a whole program, a whole initiative talking about saving antibiotics. Antibiotics, millions of years. Here we go. Antibiotic resistance has been identified as a top health crisis. The overuse of antibiotics has sped up the development of superbugs. Yet, livestock producers still routinely give antibiotics, the same or similar ones used to doctors, to treat animals that aren't even sick. Do any of you know about this topic? Have you studied it, this idea of giving them to animals that aren't even sick? Why would a pig farmer, a chicken farmer, a cattle rancher give antibiotics to an animal that isn't sick? Anyone want to jump in?
Being proactive?
Proactive, okay, we call it proactive or prophylactic, meaning that if you give them the antibiotic, then they won't catch the disease. That is part of it. And that's an important part, Ethan, but there's an additional reason. Anyone else want to jump in? I don't have the data here, but I will just tell you, keep it in the back of your minds. Animals that are given antibiotics, even if they're not sick, or even if they're not, the farmer, the rancher isn't even worried about them getting sick. For example, chickens. If you put antibiotics in chicken feed, the chickens will gain weight quicker. Okay, this is independent of any disease prevention. Basically, they put on weight more quickly, and so they can reach a marketable weight more quickly, which means the farmer can make more money. So it is actually, much of this antibiotic use is not even related to disease prevention from a prophylactic perspective, but to increase weight gain, to increase growth. That's the reason. And so the criticism is that farmers who do that are putting our antibiotic resources at risk, because when you have the widespread use of antibiotics just added as a matter of course into chicken feed, and that's why if you look at the chicken that you eat, sometimes it will say, if you're getting higher priced, say organic chicken, it will say antibiotic free. Okay, that's not your cheap chicken, that's your more expensive chicken. So that's something to be aware of. I'm going to continue. I'm going to stop sharing this. Okay, so that's the issue of antibiotics. Here we go. Next thing I want to mention is pesticides. Okay, pesticides, these are substances intended to prevent, destroy, repel, mitigate a pest. We're talking about insects, other plants. Yes, other plants could be considered a pest, in which case the substances would be called an herbicide. Fungus, rodents. Pesticides are widely used. There are over 10,000 of them. That's just a ballpark estimate. 300 active ingredients, 1.2 billion pounds of this stuff is used in this country, much of it on food to reduce loss. Those apples there, would any of you eat those apples? Those apples, they are entirely healthy. They're perfectly healthy. They've got some sort of a rust or some sort of a spots on it there. They probably would be delicious tasting. In fact, they look like they might be golden or yellow delicious apples of some sort. But would you buy those apples? So maybe you're at your grandmother's place and she's got an old apple tree and it has an apple like that. You might pick it and eat it, or eat around the dark spot, or you might eat it anyhow. But would you buy an apple like that? I wouldn't pay $3 a pound for an apple like that, or $5 a pound for an organic apple that looked like that. If I could get it for free, I probably would. But we make choices, we are fussy, and consumers in general are fussy, particularly at the grocery store. We want things to look perfect. And so even though that apple might be entirely healthy, it might taste delicious, we wouldn't buy it. In much of the country, it is really hard to grow apples. Most of us in the West know that the majority or a huge percentage of apples in this country come from Washington State, particularly east of the Cascades, Yakima, Wenatchee, and other places like that. One of the reasons is because the air is dry. They can irrigate the trees lower down, and you don't get the moisture on the trees. And when you don't have that moisture, it reduces those type of spotting, those types of appearance on the apples. Okay, safety then. So pesticides, we talked about that. Pesticide safety is regulated by the FDA. All foods safety is regulated by the FDA, except the USDA regulates meat, poultry, and eggs. So here we have the reappearance of the USDA. They're promoting American agriculture. They're telling us what to eat. And they're also regulating meat, poultry, and basically food animal safety. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, yet another government agency, they are the one that approves new pesticides. And their goal, their charge is that it has no unreasonable adverse effect on people and the environment, and that the benefit outweighs the risks. I'm not going to click on it, but if you're interested in this issue, there is a pesticide data program, excuse me, where the FDA regulates the use of pesticides. They do sampling, and they report on it, this issue, and produce a summary then of pesticide usage. Pesticides in food. There's been increasing interest in organic foods because people are increasingly, at least some people are increasingly concerned about pesticides in their foods. There are a lot of health outcomes that have been linked to pesticides, not always in a causal sense. Again, the epidemiology student's idea of causation, challenging to demonstrate. But there are certainly associations. And I've got a few ones that you might find interesting. So, firstly, okay, so I will share with you this article. Okay, so this is looking at fruit and vegetable intake. This is back from 2015, 2015, pretty recent. Fruit and vegetable intake and their pesticide residues in relation to semen quality among men from a fertility clinic. So couples trying to get pregnant, it's not happening. So they're trying to figure out, okay, is it the guy's problem? Is it the girl's problem? And they are looking at fruit and vegetable intake and pesticides. So the question is consumption of fruit and vegetables with high levels of pesticide residue associated with lower semen quality? They enrolled men in a study, an ongoing prospective cohort study. Male partners, there were 155 male partners in sub-fertile, in other words, low fertility couples, provided 338 samples. Semen analyses were collected over 18-month period following dietary assessment. They looked at the sperm concentration, motility, computer-aided. Fruits and vegetables were categorized as containing high or low to moderate pesticide residue based on the USDA pesticide data program. We talked about that. And they basically are saying, okay, is there a higher association of low quality sperm amongst guys who are eating higher amounts of the high pesticide fruits and vegetables? We're going to look at it in a minute. Some fruits and vegetables, there's much higher pesticide residues than others, and so they were just looking for that association. Okay, guys, eating more fruits and vegetables with lots of pesticide, is that associated with lower sperm semen quality? So what did they do? Total fruit and vegetable intake was unrelated to semen quality parameters. High pesticide residue, fruit and vegetables, was associated with poorer semen quality. They looked at the highest quartile, the highest fourth of pesticide residue fruits and vegetables, more than 1.5 servings per day, had 49% lower sperm count and 32% lower percentage of morphological normal sperm than men in the lowest quartile. So they compared the top quarter to the bottom quarter, and they found that those that had the top quarter of high pesticide residue fruit and vegetables had 49% lower sperm count. And you can see that's statistically significant. Low to moderate pesticide residue fruit and vegetable was associated with higher percentage of morphologically normal sperm. Okay, so that doesn't prove causation, but it certainly shows an association between fruit and vegetables with more pesticides and that being associated with poor sperm quality. You can read through the paper and how they did it, but that's the takeaway message. The takeaway message. Okay, maybe there's something going on here. Maybe pesticides in fruit and vegetables is part of the problem, part of the issue. Okay, so that's the first sort of just insight onto that issue. Next one, looking at ADHD. And is my link? It's taken a minute here to, try again in a few minutes. I'm gonna try once more. I'm having a problem with my, okay, it's not, looks like it's not coming in. I had a video clip I was gonna show you. We'll just look at the article itself. Oh, Alyssa, I'm seeing you responded, the idea of increasing growth of livestock. I didn't see that till just now. You're absolutely right on that when we're talking about antibiotics. Okay, so this is looking at ADHD and urinary metabolites of organophosphate pesticides. Again, we're just going to look at the abstract. Cross-sectional data from NHANES were available for 1,139 children who were representative of the US population. A structured interview with a parent was used to ascertain ADHD. 119 children met the diagnostic criteria. Children with higher urinary dialkyl phosphate concentrations, especially dimethyl alkyl phosphate, were more likely to be diagnosed having ADHD. A 10-fold increase, and what they did is they collected urine samples and they could then isolate or detect the metabolites of these pesticides in the urine. Okay, so kids are eating the fruits or the vegetables, they have these pesticides on them, they're digested, some of the metabolites are expelled in the urine, and they can then measure those in the urine. So they weren't measuring direct intake like they were with the previous study, where they were measuring or they were calculating fruit and vegetable consumption. This case, they're actually measuring how much of these metabolites are being peed out. So then that gives you a good idea as to how much has been taken in. A 10-fold increase in these concentrations was associated with an odds ratio of 1.55, or a 55% greater outcome for ADHD. For the most commonly detected dimethyl alkyl phosphate metabolite, children with levels higher than the median of detectable had twice the odds of ADHD, so almost 2, compared with children with undetectable levels. These findings support the hypothesis that organophosphate level exposures at levels common among children may contribute to ADHD prevalence. Okay. From epidemiology, we know that these type of studies, these type of association studies, these odds ratio studies do not establish causality. But what they do is say, okay, maybe there's a problem here. Maybe there is a relationship. And you'll notice it says there at the bottom, prospective studies are needed to establish. So that's like a prospective cohort. You follow them through time. At baseline, no one has ADHD, and you follow them through time, maybe collect urine samples every so many months. And then as time passes, you see who gets ADHD, who doesn't, and see whether then those who have more urinary metabolites from these substances, in fact, get more ADHD. That would then more readily, more credibly establish causality. But it's a study like this then that gives justification for that type of larger project. Okay. I'm just trying some more. There was an interview clip with the pesticide ADHD study. It says it's not available. Don't know what's going on there. Okay, so it's 10:43. Our class is pretty much over. We'll continue on Thursday talking about these issues. We'll transition into GMOs, genetically modified organisms, another controversial and important aspect of food and food production. So, reminder about assignment 8, turn it in if you haven't. Thanks for the feedback that you gave the class on these various papers, low fat versus low carb. And I will wish you all a good day and see you on Thursday. So take care, be well, don't spend your whole day in front of a computer, go outside. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer.
Yep.